It's a wonderful opportunity to do this presentation because it is also an opportunity to reflect and think about what we're doing and think about the changes. And for me, one of the reasons why I really enjoy being involved in science communication and public engagement is because it is evolving all the time, because it is very much moving up on political and societal agendas, and because it creates all these opportunities for us to engage around the world and to learn from each other. And I think today is such a moment as well. So I asked myself in preparing for this presentation, if I talk about changes that we need, what are the challenges we face? And I promise you, I didn't talk to Joseph or Catherine beforehand, but some of the things I thought about also are similar to what they have already mentioned. So I'll just run through these very quickly. We've seen during COVID, of course, and since then, but also before then, how science increasingly becomes politicized, very closely interlinked with that, how our communication ecosystems are fragmented, algorithmic media ecology, increased use of digital and social media. These are all things we have to cope with. Of course, the infodemic became very prominent during COVID, but also before then. Conspiracy theories, fake news, pseudoscience, and now we have to add the challenges of AI and ChatGPT to that list as well. And then, of course, we know we have to face the challenges of making science and science communication more equitable, more diverse, more ethical, more inclusive. Those are the challenges as I see them. And I would love to hear, of course, from you later, whether you have other challenges that you would want to add to this list. And when I thought about the changes needed, which is the topic I'm talking about today, and this is, of course, from my perspective, the new approaches required, I would like to highlight these 5. The motivations, to think about dialogue, to think about emotions, to think about the researchers and the role they play, and definitely to think about linking research and practice. So I'll say a little bit more about each of these. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that when you want to encourage and support public science communication and engagement, there are diverse motivations. There are very diverse reasons why institutions and individuals get involved. And I think we should try and find a way of seeing these as complementary and sort of building on one another instead of contrasting them and seeing them as competing factors. Because when you do get involved practically, and even when you do research, it's no longer possible, as I see it, to put them into separate boxes. Sort of on a broad societal level, when we ask, why should we go public with science? These are the kind of answers. Science is a public good. It needs to respond to society's needs. And generally, science has moved from a closed to an open system. It's become much more interlinked with society. For about 2 or 3 decades now, people have been talking about a new social contract between science and society. And these are all strong motivations for, our field. In the academic world, of course, researchers have for a number of years been thinking about science communication motivations and the reasons why scientists should get involved. And they can largely be summarized as the following 5. There's democratic motivations. People have a right to know and participate in science. There's economic motivations. If we do this right, it ensures innovation and the future workforce. Strategically, it can benefit science and scientists and society, of course. There are moral obligations. Scientists feel obliged to give something back to society. And then last but not least, there's the idea that science is something beautiful and that we should share it with society. We shouldn't keep it to ourselves. And I think that you can see as a cultural motivation. But when I engage with colleagues and students, they also come up with what I've termed real world cycle motivations, the things that we see happening around us. And once again, this idea that, science has so many implications and applications that we cannot afford to have a society where we don't talk and share about these things. And science is not immune against public opposition. We do need public support. We need to make science more diverse and inclusive. And added to that is the sometimes sticky debate about decolonialization of science and science communication, which is very prominent in my part of the world, in Africa, of course. And then the fact that we need to help people prepare for the future and cope with the changing world when we are faced with all these emergencies around climate and biodiversity and health and all the other things. And I think, therefore, it's necessary for us to acknowledge these benefits and these motivations and to leverage them jointly. Yes, institutions get involved because they want to build reputation and profile and they want to get funding. And I think that's fine, as long as of course, as it's done ethically. But society benefits because they get access to scientists, they get involvement, they get an opportunity to have a say, which they would not otherwise have if we didn't have these linkages between science and society. For researchers and research in general, there's the advantage of making the work more relevant, accessing local knowledge, building trust and respect, and building community relationships, which is so incredibly important to sustain trust. And then for researchers themselves, we cannot deny that there's definitely benefit in recognition at an individual level, new opportunities for networking, skills building. We know that if researchers do this well, they can increase not only their public recognition, but also their academic recognition through citations, influence, funding, and definitely getting involved with the public gives them new perspectives on their own work. Something I didn't even add here is that so many researchers I talk to also tell me that they do not expect at first to enjoy it, but they do find it very rewarding and enjoyable to engage with the public. And it's really meaningful to them, and it gives them new inspiration for their research. And therefore, I think, just to summarize about all these motivations, we need to acknowledge that we do need public support. We can't deny that, but we don't want it to be just blind support. We want critical dialogue. And so the same with trust. We want public trust in science, but not blind trust. We should acknowledge that we need to talk and see different points of view and acknowledge different ways of knowing. And so along all these motivations, for me, there's a kind of a balancing act to get it right between, individual benefits versus societal benefits versus, research benefits. And it is a balancing act because I think you need to find an ethical balance between these different motivations, and you need to make sure that you do address them all. But I think these motivations can really support and encourage one another. And that links then very much to this idea that lately we know the buzzword has been, we need more dialogue, we need more engagement. And when I think back on my own career in science communication, it very much started out with what we used to call the SOS style, send out stuff, press releases, annual reports, fact sheets, brochures. We just made more and more things that we sent out into the world. And the way we did it was very much like just throw it over the wall and we just hoped it reached somebody. That was really a very dissemination kind of focused approach with very little questioning of ourselves about what did we actually achieve and what did it actually mean to the audiences. And later, when science festivals and events started to emerge, and public talks and all these kinds of things, I saw, and I would love to hear from you, if you also, those of you who have been in this field for longer, we moved to a kind of focus on counting how many people were there. 20,000 people came through the door, or we reached so many thousand people through this article in a newspaper, etc. So we were just counting numbers, but once again, very little reflection on, did people actually understand what we gave them? Did it mean anything to them? Did it actually result in any kind of desirable objective? Did it change any behaviors, etc.? And so as the science of science communication developed over time, people started questioning this model of just giving out information, just making more and more facts available. And scientists started developing the models of science communication. And I'm not going to go into detail of that today, but just to say something about the much discussed and maligned deficit model. And the deficit model of science communication, the way I see it, the problem is not that we give people information, but the problem is that we assume that they will accept it and they will support everything that we say, and that any opposition they had towards science would simply disappear if we give them more information. And that is the problem with the deficit model. It's not the giving of the information that's problematic. It's the expectation that people will simply accept it. And of course, through many negotiations and dialogues and debates in the academic and practitioner world, we became aware that we really need to go beyond dissemination. We need to have public engagement, because people filter the information we give them through their own filters. They don't necessarily see it the way we hope that they will. People want to have a say. We also acknowledge that when we are engaged with the communities, the research becomes more relevant and ethical. And importantly, engagement gives us an opportunity for mutual benefit and mutual learning. Scientists can learn something from the public. I do think, however, I just wanted to add this here because it is, maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but I do think that we have to acknowledge that there is an inherent value in science communication. Sometimes people need to and want to hear from experts. And we saw that during COVID as well. But we can't stop there. We need to go further. We need to also listen to people. And I think that if we do that, if we add dialogue and engagement to the provision of information, that is ideally the systemic change that we need. The third one I want to highlight is this idea that we should keep human nature in mind when we communicate science. And this means that we shouldn't shy away from making emotional connections. In fact, connecting with your audience on an emotional level has really been proven to be a key part of effective science communication. We know that scientists have lots of facts and information, but they can sometimes come across as competent but cold. And what we need for people to trust scientists and to really engage with us is warmth. We know that people respond to that if you bring yourself into the story, if you show your own passion, if you share your own concerns, and if you can combine the facts and the competence and the knowledge with that emotional connection, that's when you really have effective engagement. And I like to think of it as a way of, once again, a kind of balancing act between lots of facts and data on the one hand, but on the other hand, a story that keep people engaged, that really involve people, that really engage people. So that is my third big change that I think is necessary. Sorry, I think somewhere my numbering went wrong. But anyway, the next one that I want to talk about is I really believe that the researchers themselves are key in science engagement. There are many other role players, of course, journalists, professional filmmakers, policymakers, funders, professional science communicators. But all of us in this environment go back to the scientists themselves for expert knowledge and for evidence and for the latest access to cutting edge information. And therefore, I really believe that as institutions and as researchers also, and as funders, we need to think about how we can better support, recognize, and protect the researchers who engage with society. If I ask myself from my own research and also from my own experience, what are the major challenges that researchers themselves experience? It remains a list that I'm sure many of you have seen before, and it comes and goes, and some of these are changing and they are improving, but they're sort of still there. The fact that science communications are still perceived by some as a low status activity, and that researchers are often very unsure about whether their institutions want them to do it or not, what are the policies, and what kind of support can they actually access. And that they may be criticized by their peers, for seeking the limelight, for putting themselves out there. There could be concerns over intellectual property rights and other sort of non-disclosure agreements with funders. And then still, in this fast evolving, rapidly changing communication ecosystems, they really need help. They really need resources and skills and help from experts. We cannot reasonably expect scientists to be able to navigate this environment on their own. And I think it's time that we come out as a community and say, yes, there are rewards. There's tangible, practical rewards. There's also intangible rewards for scientists, but there's risks as well. And we've seen during COVID, once again, how some scientists really faced public criticism and even worse, for going out into public. And scientists may not always, we also need scientists and the public to understand why they don't necessarily always agree. What is the value of disagreement and debate in the scientific world and also in the public domain? And then this was mentioned before as well by Catherine, and I couldn't agree more, the need to better link science communication, research, and practice. We see, if we look at this continuum from science to communicating about science to doing research about science communication and teaching it, they are different and sometimes overlapping role players, but they have very different professional norms and values. And if we ask ourselves, why is science communication practice not more based on evidence? There are so many reasons why. Of course, research takes much longer than practice. There's this sort of speed and jargon and relevance gap. We know that scholarly articles about science communication are scattered across many different journals. There are a few journals dedicated to the field, but increasingly science communication scholarship is also published in disciplinary journals, and therefore it's very hard for practitioners to access the knowledge, to find it. It's very difficult to review current research because of inconsistent terminologies and the way that it is published across so many different journals. And then last but not least, this gap between science communicators who often come from a natural or physical sciences background, but the fact that when you go into science communication research, you become a social scientist. I think, Catherine, you also mentioned it, that we also sometimes need the practitioners to become social scientists. And that's a big move from becoming an enthusiast about science to sometimes becoming more critical and reflecting more critically on the relationship between science and society. But I do believe that research can really help practitioners to understand better how science communication works, to cope and manage the effect of all these changing ecosystems, to understand the factors and the role players that shape science communication, to find evidence of effective practice and novel approaches so that we don't reinvent the wheel and can learn from others, and to understand different audiences and how to advance diversity and inclusivity, and definitely to do better and more meaningful evaluation so that we can improve our practice over time. And so I also believe my message is equally strongly to researchers to link better and more effectively with the practitioners, because working with practitioners can give you access to real-world case studies, to new insights and perspectives on the challenges that people face who are actually at the grassroots in science communication, and also new ideas for research, of course, and again, making sure that our research is responsive and relevant. So for science communication researchers, we have to practice what we preach for other researchers, and we also have to engage in dialogue, and we also have to make a much more definite effort to engage with practitioners. So to wrap it all up then, those are my 5 big system changes that I think is called for. Recognize the diverse motivations, get them to work together, think about ways to adding dialogue and engagement to public communication, but acknowledge that public communication has inherent value. Keep human nature in mind, value emotional connections, then support, recognize, and protect the researchers, and better linkages between science communication, research, and practice. Of course, one could do a whole talk about each one of these 5 motivations, but I hope that this very high-level, superficial overview will be useful for further discussion later today. And I will just conclude then with my contact details. In case anybody wants to engage, I would welcome it to speak to you.